You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome to the Final Say Radio Show. We have Paul R. Gregory, who's a research fellow with the Hoover Institution and an expert in Russia and Eastern Europe, and we're so happy that he's able to join us. Mr. Gregory, welcome. This is Brett Rappaport, and John Rappaport, my co-host, is joining us today. How are you?
I'm fine. Looking forward to talking to you.
Yes, well, and again, thank you so much for joining us. We have been, for some time now, discussing the relations between Russia and the United States, and since the events which have been unfolding in Ukraine, with first some of the protesting, followed by the change in governments, followed by the Russia basically coming into the Crimea, and now the war that we see, I guess you can term it as a civil war, going on in the eastern part of the country. And of course, there's a lot of I guess both political and military involvement on the parts of players around the world. But it leads to some even greater problems as we see the downing of the Malaysian airline, sanctions, the tit for tat between Russia, the European states and the United States. And so I would like to get your perspective first on, have we really been given a satisfactory answer as to what happened with this airline downing and who is responsible? And are both parties, the United States or the Europeans or Russia, being responsible with the language and the verbal war which is going on right now?
The answer to the question who downed the Malaysian Airlines flight is fairly easy to get. I've written on it extensively. I blog on Forbes, and the answer is that separatist forces had received these anti-missile systems from the Russians. This is well documented. They had used these missile systems to down Ukrainian incoming aircraft at around the same altitude. Just a day or two before, there are all kinds of photographs of these so-called Buck missile systems, and we have a lot of telephone intercepts talking about this, and it's very clear that separatist forces thought there was an incoming Ukrainian military aircraft. They shot it down, and they were quite shocked to learn it was a civilian plane. This was evident within 10 minutes of the plane being shot down. So there's no mystery in my mind, and I believe there's no mystery in anyone's mind outside of Russia.
And I'm so glad that you said all that, because I believe that to be the case too. And I'm not so, I wouldn't be so quick to ever say that they purposely shot down that airliner, because it does appear as though they thought it was just a Ukrainian plane, a transport plane or something similar. And maybe perhaps the lack of experience, they weren't able to tell, and maybe not being tied into the proper radar systems or whatnot, couldn't as accurately identify the type of plane or whatnot that it was. That being said, I still notice certain members within the media still talking about the fact that the United States hasn't really divulged the actual evidence, so we don't know that that's the case. And I would simply argue, I don't think it's proper even for the United States to divulge certain evidence, because it would reveal the types of systems and some of the security apparatus that we have in making such determinations.
The Russian media has made a big point out of U.S. not releasing its evidence. I agree with you, it's really not our job to do so, but I think one can read a lot into the very significant change in mind of European leaders, which followed what must have been the presentation of our evidence to them. It was our presentation of the evidence we have that it was shot down in the manner I described that really unleashed the sanctions. So the way we go about it is to inform the leaders of the world what happened and not inform the public. But as I say, the Russian propaganda has made a big point of our not releasing it publicly.
Right, and I certainly agree with that. Now, we find ourselves weeks later, the search crews, they're still trying to recover bodies. They're having great difficulty, of course, because of the fighting that's going on there, and for other reasons. And I think at this point, I believe that the Dutch were calling off some of the search for the bodies because of the danger that the people on the ground are facing with the fighting that's going on. But I think this goes to a bigger problem beyond the downing of the airplane. It seems to me that Vladimir Putin, and he may have legitimate reasons and concern for why he has interest in eastern Ukraine. I would name one. There's a lot of manufacturing which is involved with military infrastructure of Russia that happens there, so they do have an interest. But it seems to me that Vladimir Putin he's digging in. He's become even more belligerent. It seems to me that he's transferring more weapons. He's giving more support to the East, and it's escalating because, on the other hand, we have to continue to support Ukraine, or seems to be what our policy is. And I'd like to add one more thing to that. I've noted that the Ukrainian government from Kiev has continually used the term terrorism when referring to the pro-Russian separatists in the East, and I've come to know that there's a significant amount of money in a slush fund that the Obama administration is able to use when in dealing with terrorism. And I think there's a relationship, and it gives the Obama administration an easy out without getting any additional authority to give support to the Ukrainian government in Kiev to help combat terrorism. So I'd love your thoughts on all that, please.
You made an interesting point that I am not aware of, and that is that the United States may be supporting Ukraine more than I believe it to be supporting Ukraine, because publicly we are giving virtually nothing to Ukraine. So if there is this slush fund that's being used under the name of combating terrorism, that's something new to me, and actually it would be a welcome surprise. I think the term terrorism is appropriate rather than separatist or insurgent because what Russia is doing is sending in mercenaries who are being commanded by actual Russian intelligence officers. They have stirred up locals, and there is resentment in East Ukraine because East Ukraine is depressed. It's had bad governance over the years and so forth, so it's pretty easy to recruit dissatisfied people. I would not call it a civil war. I would call it a Russian operation directed from Russia, which is becoming increasingly open and not concealed. They're now firing across the border and controlling Ukrainian airspace. So although a lot of the media like to call this a civil war, I would not use that term. Final point is that the territory that is being fought over is the Donbass, which is a metallurgical region, which is quite depressed. It requires subsidies. So the more sophisticated industries, defense industries, etc., are really outside of this range and outside of Putin's range. So thinking of it economically, they're really fighting over something that has very little value.
Well, one of the things that's very compelling about this entire thing is obviously the potential as a catalyst for conflagration. And we saw, forget the fact that I don't particularly have a lot of confidence in our president's leadership, as most European leaders don't seem to have. But even most of the Europeans seemed fairly standoffish on this until the MH17 was shot down. And now you've seen a more aggressive stance there. And in fact, just yesterday or this morning, you saw released polls coming out of Germany that shows a significant number of Germans are now fearing the potential for a Russia on NATO tensions to actually turn into some level of a warfare. So the question I have for you, with all of the risks in the backdrop, do you think that effective American leadership would be better off with more direct confrontation with Russia in terms of weapons to Ukraine and things of that nature, or going after other areas that are important to Russia, for example, putting more pressure on the reducing Russian influence, for example, in Cuba, Syria, Iran, etc.? In other words, could we impact them, possibly reduce the risk of conflagration by striking them in other areas that would potentially diffuse this situation, or at least not pour gas on the fire?
I think that we have a couple of options, but I would criticize the Obama administration for simply not understanding Putin. Putin is a person who grew up with KGB training and experience and thinks like a KGB person, and it is his mode of behavior to probe the enemy until you encounter resistance. The Obama administration, however, has naively felt that if we're nice to Putin, if we give him certain things that he wants, he'll be nice back to us. This was the so-called reset. So we simply have not learned that if you don't provide resistance to this probing, he's just going to continue probing. So in my view, it's more dangerous not to stand up to him than to stand up to him. And I believe this is a very basic insight that the Obama administration lacks, and I think it's cost us a lot. So that's a sort of philosophical answer to your question.
Well, I think it's a very solid answer, because it's indicative of policies that are happening all over the planet. It's not just with what the risk is in Ukraine. Whenever we talk about situations like this, we always look at the quote-unquote adults in the room. Do you believe there are other parties within the Russian infrastructure, either military or political, that could in any way be reached out to, that could help have some sobering effect on this? Or are we basically just looking at a Putin-run oligarch, and we can only confront him head-on because that's the only way he'll be respected, and that's the only way his people will respect us? The
so-called liberal forces in the Putin government have very little sway over Putin. The hardliners do have considerable sway over Putin. He's eliminated opposition, so you can't go out on the street and demonstrate without risk of being thrown in jail. The liberals who oppose the war have come out. They've published articles showing how costly this will be to Russia, and the fact that this really isn't all necessary. But I see no way in the world that Putin is going to retreat, because he regards this conflict with Ukraine as existential, that if he backs down, he could perhaps be unseated. So for him, it's existential, so he'll not retreat. And that's the one thing that I believe is certain about Putin. He will not retreat. So even though the separatists are losing right now, he's simply not going to allow them to lose. And although most people think he will not invade, I think if he sees that that's his only option, he will invade. And when he invades, no one knows what's going to happen then.
And that's a very good question. And in fact, several people in our chat room are bringing up similar questions. But I'd like to ask you a couple questions in one, and I think they're all related. And it is right now we have sanctions. The Europeans seem to be now on board with the sanctions. But there's a question as to how much weight can the sanctions have, and is there a possibility that it may actually hurt the European Union more than Russia at this point? Because Russia could always turn to trade with Iran, for example, or China or other places, and if they ever did pull the natural gas pipeline, cut off the natural gas to Europe, that could cause significant problems. So that's one part of the question. And do we need to look closer at the relationship of the BRICS countries and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as potential threats as well and part of this story?
I think the second question is probably too broad to answer. The first question is simpler to answer. Russia lives off the gas revenue it gets from Europe, so it cannot afford to forego that revenue. If it did, its state budget would collapse and the Russian economy would collapse. So one thing is certain, and that is that Russia will continue to faithfully supply Europe with gas. Iran is a small market, so it's not going to make much of a difference. China is a big market. Russia has struck a deal with China for long-term development of natural gas sales into China, but that deal is at very unfavorable terms to Russia compared to the money it makes in Europe. The sanctions will hurt Europe, they'll hurt Germany, but they will hurt Russia by a factor of 10 times. So, I think it took the Malaysian airline shoot down to bring Europe on board. Without that, it wouldn't have happened, because Europe will suffer a little bit from this, but Russia will suffer a lot.
Well, that's very interesting, and I agree with that analysis. Last question that I would have for you today, and thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. I never actually, in my mind, felt like the Cold War ended because of the leadership of and having someone like Putin in charge of Russia. And I look at some of the things that have been eroding, which are taking us into a path which perhaps a few years ago we would have thought unthinkable. But you see the cooperation of our space program, falling apart. We have perhaps, and most likely, violations of the INF, the nuclear agreements that have been in place. I'm troubled personally by the START agreement. I think it's a terrible agreement that we signed on to, the recent one. And then you have the other trade between the nations and with Europe. So as all these things seem to be eroding, it does seem to be that we're on a clear path to re-enter the Cold War, and that's sort of why I brought up the alliances of the BRICS and SCO. And I know you don't want to get into all that because it's too much to really cover, but I do think that the dynamics have completely changed.
Let me close by saying that we've not been paying attention.
Yes.
Russia has pictured us as enemy number one for the last decade. We've simply not paid attention to that fact. And we're seeing the consequences of not having paid attention. We were distracted by this reset idea. But if you watch Russian television, if you watch what's coming out of Russia, we are their number one enemy, and NATO is their number one enemy. So this has been going on a while. We've just not noticed it.
And I don't know if you're aware, but my wife was actually born in St. Petersburg, and we have a lot of Russian speaking in my household, and those channels are on quite often. I don't know everything that they're saying, but I do know exactly what you're talking about, and I call it propaganda TV.
Yeah, you're right.
Anyway, Paul R. Gregory, you could find him at hoover.org. He's a research fellow with the Hoover Institute. Paul, do you have a Twitter feed or any other a blog?
Yeah, I'm Paul R. _Gregory. That's a Twitter.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, and you also write for Forbes.
Yeah, it's called Econ World. I post about once a week. I'm just posting something on what we're talking about. It should come up a little later today.
Oh, well, terrific. I'll be sure to post that on our Twitter feeds as well.
No, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your thoughtful analysis and sharing it with us today on the Final Say Radio Show.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.